This video will contain some parts with very racist language that I have chosen not to remove because it is part of the history that influenced the state of international relations during this period. Keeping this language helps us understand why the fortunes and social standing of the Zanj changed, especially with regards to the treatment they received from their Arab allies, for whom they had served as loyal mercenaries. They raided, looted, and destroyed from Alexandria to caravans headed to Khorasan in Persia, which were key cultural and intellectual hubs during this time. The term Arab originally meant traveler, and most if not all Arabs were and still are merchants. These piracy actions taken by the Zanj seem to have gained the Arabs valuable possessions from these cultural hubs that paved the way for their Arab Islamic Golden Age, but that's for another video. In this video, we will focus on the identity of the Zanj, so let's begin. The identity of the Zanj has always been known and rather obvious for anyone willing to consult the primary source, Al-Masudi, who was the foremost geographer during the Abbasid Caliphate. I will be butchering a lot of these names and words. I will do my best to pronounce the words correctly, but I apologize for the ones I get wrong in advance. So let's continue. The Zanj as East African Bantu narrative has been pushed by some historians, especially European and Western historians, because when they arrived in Africa, they found the Zanj in the Bantu territory. They assumed, and in some instances, were informed by those Africans that they did not remember where they came from. And some of them did lie. They remembered, but they just didn't want to say. So this became a blank, and Africa became this place where people did not know their history. But we know our history. It's in our languages and any admixtures they contain. So in my first video about the Zanj, I relied on linguistics, ethnology, and general dates, and that revealed that the Zanj were from the Sahara region, making them Nilo-Saharan and not East African or from Bantu territory. And I managed this without using Al-Masudi's work because I hadn't found it yet. And this verifies and validates that understanding linguistics and ethnology in Africa while being objective helps us explain African history. Al-Masudi's work helps us verify our findings because he personally knew the Zanj. Africa has been historing far before the Arab, Islamic, or European arrival, and my work is meant to go beyond the Luva-Lunda, Mani-Kongo, Kola, Shaka, Mzilikazi Islamic narratives to help us create an accurate picture of African history. So we're going to be going further back, but today we're going back to 800 AD because that is where the Zanj were identified by one of their own, Al-Jahiz. He was an influential Afro-polymath and race relations expert who lived during the Abbasid Caliphate in Basra, Iraq. So let's start here. The Zanj were not primarily a Proto-Bantu derived population out of East Africa, but rather their country or territory was west of West African Sudan, not modern-day Sudan, but the first Sudan which spanned across the Sahara Belt, and they were Nilo-Saharan. The misidentification of the people known as Zanj is most likely due to this map by Al-Istakri, who is virtually unknown apart from his meeting with Ibn Khaldun. I have butchered those two, who was an Arab geographer born around 932 CE or AD. Both of their work came much later than Al-Masudi, who lived between 896 and 956 CE or AD. Al-Masudi wrote the most detailed and extensive works concerning history and geography of the early Arab Islamic known world during the Abbasid Caliphate. Al-Masudi's geographical description is the foremost source and continues to serve as a primary source for all historians during this period. Although Al-Masudi's work is extensive and detailed, it has an extreme bias and is very negative of the Zanj, so much so that he fails to objectively highlight their historical contributions in connection to the development of the Arab Islamic world. Al-Masudi fails to mention that the Zanj had been princes and kings in those lands who offered the Arab population protection from invading populations prior to the adoption of Islam. This part of Zanj history is documented in Al-Jahiz's work. Al-Jahiz was an influential Afro-Iraqi writer whose work predates them all because he lived earlier, and the Zanj uprising, it reads more like an uprising once you read about it than a rebellion, so I call it an uprising. This took place a few months after his passing in 869 CE or AD. The date is disputed. Some people say 868. I say 869. This is a quote from Al-Jahiz regarding the matter of Zanj-Arab relations. You claim that your people have never been subjugated or paid tribute, but paying that you will find easier than fleeing. Here, Al-Jahiz was talking to the Arab people, and what he's saying here is that without the Zanj's military might to protect them, the Arab population would have been constantly fleeing their attackers and raiders. That the Zanj protection is what offered them stability. Now here is a very brief account of Al-Jahiz. I have a link below in the description box if you want to read his work. He has a very long name that I will not even attempt here because I know I will butcher it. So to spare us all, I am not going to attempt it, and I'm not writing a test. So I will just call him Al-Jahiz. And he lived between 776 and 869 CE or AD. He wrote the work titled The Trysts on the Glory of the Black Africans over the Whites, and in this case he means Arabs and anybody who had lighter skin. It was a book on race, and it showed how the race talk had been going on for a while in this region, and in it he defended the virtues and achievements of the Zanj against the Arab-led racial prejudices. He highlighted the Zanj's strengths, intelligence, and cultural contributions to this part of the world. It is because of him that we learn that the Zanj were human beings and not just slaves. We learn about their values, their way of life, and he pretty much shows us that they were more than just these savage people who were doomed to be enslaved, abused, and then forgotten. It is Al-Jahiz's work that reveals the Zanj had initially been princes of valor, well, more like mercenaries. They seem to have been mercenaries who hired themselves out to protect Arab interests because the Arabs were not very good at defending themselves. So Al-Jahiz balances Al-Masudi's writings about the Zanj, and both sources help us form a clear picture on what is often a misidentified population. In addition, Al-Jahiz wrote the following regarding further Arab-Zanj relations. Yet the desert is full of Zanj married to Arab wives, and they have been princes and kings and have safeguarded your rights and sheltered you against your enemies. You even have sayings in your language which vaunt the deeds of our Zanj kings, deeds which you often place above your own. Now this is in sharp contrast to Al-Masudi's later writings in 900 CE or AD. That was more like 950 going up, in which, regarding the Zanj, he heavily focused on dehumanizing them to reduce them to nothing but ugly people with dark skin, no culture or intelligence. His words, he focused a lot on the skin. And this is a quote from Al-Masudi, which shows the disdain the Arabs had developed towards their old Zanj protectors. Tawas el-Yamani, the companion of Ben al-Abbas, this was their prophet's companion, would not eat any meat slain or sacrificed by a Zanji. He used to say, a Zanji is a hideous slave. We have heard that Ben el-Muqtada would never take anything from the hand of a black man, saying he was a hideous slave. There's a very strong emphasis on the skin tone of the Zanj during this time, that their black skin tone was something that wasn't wanted or preferred, even though Al-Jahiz shows that their prophet had said that he had come for the black and red people. So, in alienating themselves from the black people, Al-Jahiz's argument was that the Arabs could not claim the prophet. And it becomes a very interesting debate and conversation. It's worth reading about, really, because it helps us explain the state of things and why everyone else suddenly got affected by this situation going on up there. But to continue, we will now get into the physical description of the Zanj according to Al-Masudi, and it will be very offensive, so please be warned. He uses extremely triggering and cruel language. I will read the quote. It reads, "The Negroes have 10 qualities which are peculiar to them and not found in any other nation: crisp hair, scanty eyebrows, expanded nostrils, thick lips, sharp teeth, smelly skin, black complexion, fissures in their skin of the hands and feet, longum metulum, and great levity." There's an entire prose about donkey privates in Al-Jahiz's writing, so that is what the longum metulum is about. It's important to understand that the term Negro was specifically applied to the Sudan, West African, Niger Delta, Cameroon populations. During this time, and even during the European colonial period, and even after the 1900s, 1800s, it had never really been applied to people in Southern Africa and East Africa. It is also part of why these populations from the Nilo-Saharan West African Sudan tended to forcefully abduct other Africans, such as the San and Proto-Bantu women, the Abyssinians, to protect or edit their own phenotype so that they could fit in, because they had received a lot of ridicule and abuse on their appearance from their Arab allies, and this created a complex. And I know this because my grandmothers talked about the abductions of young women, but these women came from more matrilineal and matriarchal societies, and they could not fit into this patriarchy, so they were very bad wives for these men, and the men pretty much ended up hating them. And this was one reason the husbands from the Hutu group during the Rwandan genocide tended to murder their wives who were Tutsi, because there was a cultural clash, and these men were forcing themselves to be with women they actually loathed and did not actually love. And so when the opportunity presented themselves, they butchered them and blamed the women for their own vanity. And so these are conversations that we need to have as Africans, because they are a real problem, and they are an underlying problem in Africa, where some groups have inferiority complexes and they tend to want to edit their phenotypes, so they will marry other groups who they feel will do that for them without understanding the culture or respecting the culture of that group and how it could clash with their own culture. And this creates a lot of problems for everyone. So we should talk about that. And teeth sharpening was also a distinctly Nilo-Saharan and West African Sudanic people practice. There were some people among the Sutu who sharpened their teeth and had a tuft of hair on their crown. And this is how we are sure the Zanj invaded the Proto-Bantu in that part of Africa, because this population evolved to become the first Sutu people, and they were initially called Wataung. And during this period, we see a change in language and an additional sort of a cultural admix that happens to this Proto-Bantu indigenous population that had been in that region before. And even the Arab writers do note that there was a change in the population that happened. These Zanj that had invaded Sofala had sharpened teeth, and the Proto-Bantu did not and do not practice teeth sharpening at all. It has to do with vanity, and the only thing they did to their teeth was knock out their teeth, and this happened in the late 1800s, and this was done to escape the slave raider. After they had lost the protection of their stone city Tumzirikazi in 1838. In comparison to the Zanj physical description, this is a physical description of the Vanai, which means the nameless ones, who were a group of the Proto-Bantu who refused to become subjects of any of the invaders. They suffered a lot for this, and this is a description from David Livingstone in the 1800s. They hadn't changed much physically. Here it goes. A great many of the Vanai are of a light coffee milk color. That description alone sets us apart from the Zanj description. We also see this description present in Sebetwani in the 1800s, who was part of the Sutu people, who were the Proto-Bantu that were invaded by the Zanj and became Sutu, and he is described by David Livingstone in the following way. Sebetwani was about 45 years of age, of a tall, weary form, an olive or coffee and milk color, and slightly bald. As we read David Livingstone's records in the 1800s, we see this olive or coffee and milk color skin tone among populations with shaved teeth, a Nilo-Saharan Sudanic practice, because the skin tone lifted their status and it became a veil of protection for these populations, which I mentioned earlier. And they still kept their old practices, but had integrated or married the Proto-Bantu, who sort of gave them this new skin tone. Most of these procreations were abductions, and they were forced. And this is another quote about the Proto-Bantu, at least the last surviving group out of Matabele land. The Batoka of the Zambezi are generally dark in color and very degraded with a Negro-like appearance, while those who live in the highlands, we are now ascending, are frequently of a coffee and milk color. I add this last quote because the people on the plateau or highland that he mentions are the lost survivors of Muzilikazi's genocide who came out of what became Matabele land. They were the Proto-Bantu who were largely isolated from these raids over this period of almost 1,000 years. The Batoka in the valley or lowlands, whom he describes as degraded, were once part of the Mongas, who were warriors that had defended but lost to the Zanj, specifically Muzimba, and later Kazembe, then the Shonas, and other West African Sudanic peoples, which contributed to the change in their phenotype because as time went by, there were less of them around to counter or balance out the phenotype change. So eventually these new populations became more than they were because they had been genocided, and so they started over time to adopt the new population's phenotype, and that's why they looked the way they did, even though they still practiced the culture and we still consider them part of the Proto-Bantu. So in conclusion, the preservation of this Abyssinian phenotype among the Zanj is one reason the Sutu isolated themselves. It was a very important part of what happened in Africa, at least in Southern Africa with the raids. It was also about changing the physical appearance of people, and that's why today some populations in the Sahel or East Africa don't marry other black or African looking Africans to preserve this phenotype. It's still practiced today. So I hope you learned something from this video. In the next video I will cover the location of the Zanj according to Al-Masudi, who is our actual primary source and the person who actually knew who the Zanj were and where they were located. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe. And thank you to all our coffee supporters. You make this research and these videos possible. If you would like to support this channel and this research and these videos, please give to our coffee account. The link is in the description box below. Thank you for watching.